prayers. Well, tonight we're going to be continuing on the Ecclesiastes series. It's only taken me, 2 years probably to finally get on this and get closer to the end. We're on Ecclesiastes chapter 8. So after a little bit of a hiatus there, we're finally back into the book of Ecclesiastes. So the last time, and it's kind of funny, today I probably scared Brother Tony again because just as I was thinking I was going to get out of work early and I was going to have time to come home and read my notes, maybe take a little bit of a nap, and the Mount Vernon plant called me again. They said, "Hey, can you come up here and look at this injury?" I told the safety lady, I said, "Why is it every time I got to preach you call me?" And I thought, well, maybe I shouldn't make her feel bad for calling me, but I didn't know what I was going to be getting into, and I just prayed all the way up there, said, "Lord, let this lady's hand be okay by the time I get there, because I just don't have 3 hours to spend in the ER to get nowhere again." And by the time I got up there, I met the lady, her hand was okay, and just praying that it'll heal all up. Tomorrow everything will be fine. I didn't have to go to the ER or anything tonight, so I'm just thankful for that. Just really praise the Lord for that, because on my way up there, I'm just thinking, it's like, why is it every time I'm supposed to be here on a Wednesday night, something like that happens? But Lord took care of it. So Ecclesiastes 8. So let's just start reading this. Sometimes I get all the way through it, and other times I find that I need to stop to just talk about it as I go, kind of like we did with chapter 7. But I'm going to start reading here in Ecclesiastes chapter 8. It says, "Who is as the wise man, and who knoweth the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom maketh his face to shine, and the boldness of his face shall be changed. I counsel thee to keep the king's commandment, and that in regard of the oath of God. Be not hasty to go out from his sight, and stand not in an evil thing, for he doeth whatsoever pleaseth him. Where the word of the king is, there is power. And who may say unto him, What doest thou? Whoso keepeth the commandment shall feel no evil thing, and a wise man's heart discerneth both time and judgment. Because to every purpose there is a time and a judgment, therefore the misery of man is great upon him. For he knoweth not that which shall be, for who can tell him what it shall be? There is no man that hath power over the Spirit to retain the Spirit, neither hath he power in the day of death. And there is no discharge in that war, neither shall wickedness deliver those who are given to it. All this I have seen, and applied my heart unto every work that is done under the sun. There is a time wherein one man ruleth over another to his own hurt. And so I saw the wicked buried, who had come and gone from the place of the holy, and they were forgotten in the city where they had done so. This is also vanity, because sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily. Therefore the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. Though a sinner do evil 100 times, and his days be prolonged, yet surely I know that it shall be well with them that fear God, which fear before him. But it shall not be well with the wicked, neither shall he prolong his days, which are as a shadow, because he feareth not before God. There is a vanity which is done upon the earth, that there be just men, whom it happeneth according to the work of the wicked, and again there be wicked men, to whom it happeneth according to the work of the righteous. And I said, that also is vanity. Then I commended mirth, because a man hath no better thing under the sun than to eat and to drink and to be merry, for that shall abide with him of his labor the days of his life, which God giveth him under the sun. And when I applied mine heart to know wisdom, and to see the business that is done upon the earth, for also there is that neither day nor night seeth sleep with his eyes, then I beheld all the work of God, that a man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun, because though a man labor to seek it out, yet he shall not find it. Yea, farther, though a wise man think to know it, yet shall he not be able to find it out. Take a drink after reading it. So I don't know if it's just because I got some new commentaries, or I think it's just more in particular with this chapter of Ecclesiastes. I find that this is one that I can preach on it this way, this time, and I could probably come back and preach all year on this book of Ecclesiastes, or this chapter of Ecclesiastes, and preach something different every time. There's actually, in the Proverbs, and this chapter in particular has several of Solomon-like proverbs in it, and they can be taken in many different ways. There's many different applications, and it's interesting, when you read the King James Version versus some of the other versions of the 8th chapter here, that you will see a lot of differences in the translation of this 8th chapter. And we're going to talk just a little bit about those, but I kind of want to keep it flowing along with our study that we've done in the other chapters. So I'm going to hit on some of the highlights, but this certainly is not all that is in this 8th chapter. So as we kind of covered in our previous chapters here, that Solomon, he began to look really at the failings of even good men. And he saw all men, women, children, all humanity had failings. He even looked at himself. We saw that in that 7th chapter. We kind of said, in a way, that kind of sounds like Solomon's confession towards the end, because he's speaking really of the women that led to his downfall. And so he saw that not just everybody else had failings, not just everybody else had committed sin before God, but he said that I myself am amongst those. God created us pure and holy, but yet all men have gone astray. All men have found those evil devices, and they've gone away from God, and he included himself in that. So now that he's looked at what the failings of good men are, I see here he's moving on and he's asking himself, well, then what would a wise man look like? And as I'm reading, it's funny, because as I'm reading Ecclesiastes here, I'm thinking of Daniel. I'm thinking of, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I'm thinking of some of these people. If you think of the time frame we're talking about here, Solomon's writing this before Daniel. He's writing it before any of those wise men who stood before kings. But certainly, he could have looked back to Moses. He could have looked back to Joseph and other men that had stood before kings. And so here, looking at what a wise man will look like, and how will we know if we saw one? And what are the benefits of goodness and wisdom? So in chapter 7, we saw that there were some tests there for one who thought that they were righteous. Namely, Solomon called upon those righteous people that thought that they were righteous to think about how they would feel, or how they would treat somebody that they knew was talking about them behind their back. Would they be incensed? Would they go confront that person? Because he said, there you'll find out whether or not you really are righteous or not. So there were some of those tests that were given there in chapter 7. And here in chapter 8, we can see, similar tests are not as clear or as easy to see, but they're tests for the wise and the God-fearing man. And note that all of these revolve around this theme of humility now. So we've been humbled in the 7th chapter. Solomon certainly had humbled himself in that 7th chapter. And so now we move into the 8th chapter here, and we see that those that have wisdom, it says, it will change the face, and consequently it'll change the actions of a man. So a man with wisdom and God-given interpretation of a matter will beam with confidence and resolve. And you know, I think of men in the Bible. Can anybody think of somebody who had a beaming face after he had been in the presence of God? And certainly Moses. I'm hearing it whispered a little bit right there. But there's somebody whose face was changed by the presence of God. And you could think of Stephen. As he was dragged before the Sanhedrin, Acts 6:15 says that his face had the appearance of an angel. I was thinking too, I've heard testimonies. Lee Strobel's testimony is one that's very powerful. I like his testimony. And he speaks of how when the Lord saved him, he had been just an ardent atheist for years and just decided really out of spite towards his wife, that he was going to prove Christ wrong. And he ended up proving him right. He ended up writing a whole book about proving Jesus Christ as a true figure in history, and not just a true historical figure, but the Lord and Savior that he claimed to be. But one of the things that strikes me about his testimony is he says that when he got up off of the floor of his study and he walked out into his kitchen, he said immediately his family knew that there had been a change. His wife and his kids gathered around him and they asked, "Dad, what has changed with you?" Because his countenance had been changed. I remember after I got saved, and it was just that as a period of time where the Lord was just really working on me, working with me. And I came to work one day, and I certainly was probably in a more chipper mood. But I remember my boss coming to me, and she said, "Troy, what's changed?" She said, I can look in your eye, and I can see, that there's been a change." And I was able to witness to my boss, and she said, and it brought back a reminisce for her. She said, "I used to go to church, and there was a pastor there, just a little country church, and I remember they really used to preach the Bible, and how much I love to hear that, and of course, why don't you go back?" But when the Lord gets a hold of somebody, he will change his countenance. But is that for nothing? What does he change his countenance for? And really, the next thing, there's going to be the test of, has your countenance really been changed? And in today's society, I think that this is something that really speaks wisdom to us. And Solomon says, "I counsel thee to keep the king's commandment, and that in regard of the oath of God." Okay, you've been changed. Now are you able to be humble? The king has a command for you. And this is where there's some divergence in the modern day and early Jewish historians. My understanding with the early Jewish historians, they believe that this chapter spoke entirely of God and our relationship with God. So every time that the king is mentioned, it's speaking of God. And then there's some other commentators that believe that. And most of the modern commentators would say, no, it's speaking of those who are in the king's court, that the king is an earthly king. He's a man that is giving these commands. And as I kind of read through this, I kind of fall maybe a little bit more towards that side. But overall, speaking of humility, we will be under the auspices of an earthly king or the heavenly king. We're under both, and depending on where you live in the world, you may also be under an earthly king that you have to follow his commandments. So along with this newfound confidence and boldness goes the wisdom to deal in the king's court here. So the next test of a wise man is in his dealings with governance. So the powers that are over him. The ancient Jewish commentators, as I said, they fully read that this was just talking about God, whereas modern commentators believe it was an earthly king. But regardless of your take, Solomon exhorts that the truly wise man will obey authority, and he will keep the command of his king. The next part of that, though, could be read as a limitation on that obedience, that we must obey, remembering our obedience first to God. Or as some read it, because of oaths that were taken before God to serve the king. So if you read back in 1 Chronicles, the 29th chapter, you'll see that the nation of Israel, they took oaths to serve King Solomon. And they may not have liked what Solomon had ordered them to do, but yet they were to obey, remembering that oath. But I think also it could easily be applied today. Yes, we are to be obedient to the government. That's not just here in the 8th chapter of Ecclesiastes. That's also in the 13th chapter of Romans. And Peter also speaks of our obedience to the government. But yet we must do it in accordance with our oath to God as well. So there's limitations to that obedience. There are some things that the government has control over in this world, and there are some things that they do not have control over. So there are times when we do not have the luxury of being able to question the king. That's noted here. So the wise man will have to discern both the right action to take and the right time to take that action. And we do not know the future, nor can we choose the proper time and action. Thus, life can become miserable for that oppressed man, as stated already in the preceding chapter. There was a verse there that said that oppression, it drives the wise man mad. Can you imagine? We could look forward a little bit there into the days of Daniel and those wise men and what the king had asked those wise men to do. Not only are you going to have to interpret my dream, but you're going to have to tell me what that dream was. An impossible task. There was terrible oppression on these people. And had it not been for Daniel and for the deliverance that God gave these men, they would all had their heads chopped off. So surely here, and in the 8th chapter, it's speaking of that we cannot see the future. And so much of what the decisions that we have to make are miserable. It causes misery in life to not know the right way to go or decision to make. I imagine everybody can relate to that. We've all had times where we don't know what decision to make. I've had many of those times. So adding to the things which burden both the wise and the unwise alike is the fact that death comes to all. Whether it be the king or whether it be the subject, death is coming to all. And he says that there's nothing that will stay the hand of death. There's no way to retain the spirit. So when your time comes, it comes. He likens it to a war. He says there's no discharge from this war. It was allowed in the Old Testament here that you could not go to war if certain things had happened. If you'd just been married or you just bought land, or there's cases where kings would send other people to go to war for them. You were allowed to send somebody else to go to war. But when it comes to death, you cannot send anybody else in your place, physically speaking, right? If we get into the spiritual realm, there's a beautiful truth there. Somebody went in the place of those who should have died, spiritually speaking. But physically speaking, all will face death. All will face judgment. There's no discharge from it, nor will wickedness allow somebody to get away from it. It's kind of interesting. Somebody was mentioning, I had to look it up, transhumanism to me the other day. You know, there's people through wicked devices and things like that, they feel they're going to prolong their life. They're going to live for all of eternity. That's why they're probably fighting so hard to save the earth from cow farts and global warming and stuff like that, because they're going to live forever. Well, they didn't read Ecclesiastes chapter 8. It says, through wickedness you will not deliver yourself from death. You know, there's people, you know, you can find movies that make fun of this. You know, people are going to sell their soul to the devil or whatever, and that'll deliver them from death. No, it won't. Read Ecclesiastes 8. No, it won't. Wickedness will not deliver from death. So nothing will deliver us from this judgment that is upon us. So thus all are warned to be humble. Those who are subservient should be faithful to their masters, and those who are masters likewise should be just and fair in their treatment of others. And then verse 9, this is some of the commentators say, well, this kind of just sounds like it's plopped in the middle, and maybe it belongs in another portion of this. But it says, all this I have seen and applied my heart unto every work that is under the sun. And there is a time wherein one man ruleth over another to his own hurt. And it begs the question, though, who's hurt in the one ruling over another? The subjects, you know, I can think of like evil King Manasseh. You know, he was known to have sawed Isaiah in half. They put him in a log and sawed him in half. You know, so certainly his subjects, he ruled over them to their hurt. But there's also those like Moses who ruled over people to his own hurt. You know, Moses would have probably had a much nicer life in some ways if he would not have had the children of Israel tagging along with him. It caused him a lot of grief, and he bore a lot of the punishment and the pain for leading the children of Israel. But even whether these people be wicked, whether they be good, you know, even these wicked rulers will die. And it says here that there were hypocrites, essentially, that went in and out of the holy place. You know, and I'm thinking, you know, Solomon knew this very well. He expelled, if you look at his history, he expelled Abiathar, a priest who had supported his brother's attempt to take over the kingdom when David was close to death. So I wonder, in a way, was he thinking of these people, people that were hypocrites? And then also, you know, Joab, he was slain while he ran into the temple and he is holding on the horns of the altar. So there was a lot of, I guess, intrigue, and there was a lot of cleansing that had to happen around the temple during Solomon's time, especially at the beginning of his reign. So here he says that there's hypocrites, essentially wicked people, that go in and out of that holy place. They're praised daily in the city, but yet too they die and they're forgotten. Some versions say that they were praised in death. Some say that they were forgotten. Some say that it's comparing the two. The wicked were praised and the good, the righteous who should have been praised, were forgotten. So that's one of those verses that's kind of up in the air a little bit. But here, no matter how we take it, it all kind of comes down to the same thought. That there are these hypocrites. They went in and out of the holy place, but they too died. So Solomon, he sees this as a worldly worthlessness, a waste, a vanity. You know, this is something that would never be tolerated in God's kingdom. We're talking right now, he's talking about under the sun, but he's really comparing under the sun to beyond the sun. So the things here that would happen under the sun is just incredible vanity. It's worthlessness, that these hypocrites are allowed to just walk around in the temple and they're praised when they shouldn't be. But yet in this this kingdom beyond the sun, this won't be tolerated. And to add to this, it says that these sinners became even more brazen because the acts of sin are often not immediately punished. So why did these men, they sought out many evil intentions out of their heart, as noted in the end of chapter 7. Why did they do that? Well, it was because they thought that they should never be called to account for it. Why should king and subject alike fail in righteousness and humility because they do not take duty, death, and judgment seriously? That's the point he's making here. They foolishly put off that thought of death and judgment from them. Yet Solomon notices here that the acts of sin and obedience are done, both of them are done under the nose of God. You may think that you're hiding something from those who have authority over you. You may have been shrewd in how you deal with them. You may be going in and out of the holy places and have your peers fooled, but you stand naked, though, before God. Just like Adam and Eve, they thought those fig leaves of self-righteousness are going to hide their nakedness. But truly to God, they were still naked. And it's the same here. But likewise, if you're obedient in all things and wise, God takes notice. If you're conniving, disobedient, and disruptive, He takes notice and He deals accordingly. Thus Solomon has advanced his thinking to the next step. So now not only does the world require setting aright by a holy God, not only is this judgment coming, but he says now that it shall not be well with the wicked. And he doesn't say, he's not postulating here, he's not saying I think or I experimented. He says, I know. He's certain about this, that it shall not be well with the wicked. But the wicked, as the Bible says, they're going to fall into the hands of an angry God. And they did not fear Him in life, so they shall receive no benefit from Him in death. Solomon here, he sees another worthless thing on this earth. That the treatment of the righteous and the wicked do not always go according to the way which we thought that they should go. And oftentimes, this is the thing that people use to accuse God. I mean, don't you see this person over here? My mother, she was a saint and she got cancer and suffered terribly before she died. And I know this man over here, he was a murderer or he, brought harm to people and he just did a couple years in prison. They let him out. He lived this wonderful life. Whatever. It wasn't fair. They're seeing this worthlessness. They're seeing this vanity that Solomon is talking about. And they're accusing God of this and bemoaning this even still today. So how does Solomon answer this? And it's interesting because his answer is, I commend, as the King James Version says, mirth. Be merry. Joy. I don't think that Solomon has all of a sudden changed his mind and he's saying, I commend just pleasure, go out and do whatever you want. Eat, drink, and be merry. Commit all kinds of sin, fornication, whatever it may be. Do whatever you want. That's not what Solomon is saying here, but it aligns a little bit better with Paul telling us that godliness with contentment is great gain. It's a joy. He's telling people, the best you can do in these times is to take joy in what God has given you. And this is, I think, an important lesson. This is an important place to maybe slow down and for us to think and to contemplate. Because right now we are facing a time, we are facing a government, we are facing rules and regulations, we are facing incredible fear, we are facing a world that is so different from even what I grew up in the 1980s and 90s. What can we do? We look around. Are we going to accuse God? Are we going to get angry? Are we going to sit and focus on the worthlessness of this world under the sun? Solomon's saying, really, you need to think a little bit more about what God has done. And that these things are not going to continue to go unpunished. God is going to set this straight, and it will not be well with the wicked. Their end is not well. In fact, it's very bad. And if you think about it, Solomon doesn't have the revelation that we have in the New Testament. People accuse the Old Testament of being, in a way, barbaric and speaking of judgment and God's anger and those things. But really, when you look at the whole of the Old and New Testament, judgment and God's anger and those things are spoken of more in the New Testament by Jesus and the apostles than it is in the Old Testament. So Solomon didn't have the benefit of understanding heaven and hell as the way that we understand it today through the revelation that's been given to our generation. But still he knew it would be well for those who did righteousness before God and those who did wickedness, it would not be well with them. So we should take joy. We should think on the things that God has given us, the many blessings that He's given us, even in this time, and perhaps even, as I've told my wife, some of the opportunities that we might have in this time. I think there's going to be a lot of hearts that will be softened to the gospel that were not before. I think there's a lot of people who maybe thought that some of these things were kind of okay, but now as they are playing out and going further and further down the road of wickedness, they're seeing that and they're saying something's wrong, and I don't want to be a part of this anymore. So we need to take a breath sometimes, and we need to have that godliness with contentment in the situation that we're in. Who knows? Some of our family members that would have never been saved before might be more open to it as this world continues to get darker. So I'm going to just close here. So I'm about to the end of my notes here, but it says, I said here, anyone that's looking at life today and wondering at the wickedness out there, what they're going to do, here in the 8th chapter, it'd be commended that we have humility, we have obedience in the Lord. There's an obedience, and it's talking about there, yes, obedience to the king, but obedience to the king in respect to what the Lord has commanded us. There's some things that we cannot be obedient in. If it's leading to wickedness and ungodliness, those are not things that we've been commanded to be obedient in. So obedience to the Lord and contentment with what we have, for we shall all be judged. And he says back there when he's talking about the wicked and he's talking about the righteous, he says that all that is done, it's done before the Lord. And it brings to remembrance, Jesus when he's talking about the Pharisees, and he says, when you're giving your alms, when you're praying, did he say, he said the Pharisees are out there, they're doing it all in public, and they're getting the reward that they want. They're getting man's attention, they're getting the praise from men. But he says, I tell you, do that in secret, and God, your Father, who sees that in secret, will reward you openly. You will receive your reward for that. So this section, it just puts me in mind that whatever we are doing before God. There's no hiding what we are doing. Many people, they think they've hidden what they're they're doing, and they haven't. It's all done before God. So in closing here, I liked this thought, and I got it from Matthew Henry. I changed it around just a little bit, but essentially, in a final note here before we close, he says that, through the writer here, injustice in the world, and he saw injustice and imperfection. But although he saw that, he did not judge that God was to be found unjust. Instead, he rightly judged that the world was to be found in vanity. I'll say that again. The writer here, he sees the wickedness. He sees that the righteous are not treated properly. He sees that there are hypocrites out there. He sees that death comes to all. But yet he does not accuse God of being unjust. He puts the blame on the world that it's vain, it's worthless. And he's going to eventually come to the conclusion here that, you know what? It's important that we think about God, that we do His commandments, and that we are faithful to God. And all of this vanity, one of these days, it will pass away. And the only thing that's going to matter is how we live before God. Did we do wickedness before God? Or did we do righteousness before God? So, I can only commend what he commended. Joy, peace in the Lord. And if you don't have peace in the Lord, that's something to take before God. It could be maybe wickedness is holding you back. And if it is, like I said a little bit ago, we had someone who died in our place. You have to accept that. You have to accept that gift. You have to put your faith in Him, and you have to be obedient to Him. As Solomon told us, to be obedient to our King. So that's what I got for this evening. Like I said, I could have gone many ways, probably with chapter 8. So I look into chapter 9. We'll see if there's as many interpretations on that as well. But it's a beautiful book, the book of Ecclesiastes. It really gets us thinking, gets you thinking about life, and it has a lot of applications to today. So God bless you all, and I'll turn it back over to Brother Tony here.